Hey Lama, you ready for this? I don't know. If you need me, I'm on the sidelines. Okay, let's do this. The Truth is Hard, Chapter 5, The Dark Side of Residential Schools. Abuse is a difficult subject to talk about. At residential schools, it came in many forms. Verbal, physical, emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse took place, and are now on record. On arrival at school, children were separated into groups of boys and girls. Each child received a number, which sometimes became their name. Their families were discouraged, even forbidden, from visiting them. Every minute of their life was now under control of the school. An expert on residential schools, John S. Milroy, described what happened to the children in his book, A National Crime, the Canadian Government and the Residential School System, 1879 to 1986. He wrote, parts of the program of studies would disorient children and then attempt to reorient them in a place filled with European meaning. To do this, verbal and physical abuse were both used. Former students were called being screamed at, called savages and other insults, slapped, punched, thrown, whacked with a set of keys or other objects, whipped, stabbed, beaten, kicked, and locked in closets. They were punished for speaking their native language, crying, wetting the bed, disobeying rules and regulations, running away, and for telling their parents about bad things they experienced. Any action, however innocent, could merit verbal abuse and physical punishment. Children often copied the staff's abusive behavior when they were put in charge of other students. In spite of painful memories, Aboriginal people are sharing their residential school experiences. Their voices ensure that the truth is finally heard. Left, Elder Camille Russell attended St. Mary's Mission Boarding School at a Catholic school in Standoff, Alberta. He is a member of Blackfoot Society and Piercing Society. Chief Mountain seen here is located in Blackfoot Confederacy Nation territory. A first-class germ chip. File Hills Indian Residential School, 1948. Boys whitewash a fence, far right. Girls pose in uniform. Uniforms of Canadian girls in training. A United Church Club on the steps of the school. First-class germ trip. File Hills Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan was one of the many schools across Canada where children suffered from inferior living conditions. The buildings at the United Church School were overcrowded and unsanitary. In 1908, 2 girls died of tuberculosis. The principal blamed their dormitory, which was in such decrepit condition that it was later condemned. From 1907 to 1910, the boys slept year-round in a tent. By 1922, Inspector Peter H. Bryce reported 75% of the children at File Hills were dead at the end of the 16 years since the school opened. A medical inspector visited the school in 1948. Little had been done in 25 years to make it a healthier place. The main building was a fire hazard. The bathrooms and the kitchens were unsanitary. Milk was contaminated. The laundry was a first-class germ trip, he wrote about the children as if they were in person. A complete medical checkup should be made of all the inmates in the institution. Hold the phone. Hold the fucking phone. Did he just refer to the children as inmates? Yeah, they were prisoners. They were like prisoners of war, basically. A complete medical checkup should be made of all inmates of the institution, and if repairs are not carried out, it would be criminal neglect. Oh, that's just like, what the F? Yeah. On June 30th, 1949, church officials agreed to close File Hills Indian Residential School. That fall, a day school opened. Children who lived nearby walked to the day school. Other children were sent to Brandon Indian Residential School or Portage La Prairie Indian Residential School, both in Manitoba. Their new schools were no better. In 1953, a school inspector, J.W. Brecky, reported to P.E. Moore, medical director of Indian Affairs, children at the Brandon Indian Residential School are not being fed properly, to the extent that they are garbaging around in the barns for food that should only be fed to barn occupants. That gives new meaning to were you raised in a barn? Well, it's not really a joke when it comes to this, is it? No, it's not. And how will you treat children like that? Well, it is amazing what children can survive. And like animals, children are the most vulnerable species and easy to abuse because they can't speak for themselves, especially when you remove them from their parents. Monsignor Joseph Guy, oblate priest with Sisters of Providence who worked at schools in northern Alberta. Students often found the black robes mysterious and intimidating. Were they really human beings under their robes? Dun, dun, dun. Emotional and spiritual abuse. Aboriginal spiritual beliefs were pushed aside in the pursuit of the religious beliefs of the school. The spiritual abuse led to the shame about being Aboriginal. In these conditions, children lost self-confidence and self-respect. They lost how to live a family life, the love of their family, and how to love in return. They were always called savages, remembers Donald Twin, who attended the Catholic St. Bruno Indian Residential School in Joussard, Alberta. The Cree cultural educator recalls any traditional and cultural beliefs were belittled and said to be the work of the devil. Only by relating our residential school experiences can we begin to heal our wounds. Throughout all this, the residential school system could not break the spirit of our people. The survivor speaks. I was just an impersonal environment where I was just a number. I expected something positive, but all I got was scolding, yelling, slapping, humiliating, spanking, and calling us down. If we strayed even just a little. In later years, I wondered why I lacked understanding and the compassion for others. This is my legacy from my residential school years. Today, we are elders in our communities. We survived and we have a story to tell. Elder Ralph Paul Cree attended Beauval Indian Residential School in Beauval, Saskatchewan from 1944 to 1954. The Secret Experiment. We cannot survive or thrive without adequate food. Food is especially important for growing children. Without a proper diet, a child's development suffers. Former students at residential school talk about not having enough to eat. Basil H. Johnston, the renowned Anishinaabe author of Indian School Days, attended St. Peter Claver's Indian Residential School in Spanish, Ontario. He recalls receiving just enough food to blunt the sharp edges of hunger for 3 or 4 hours. In 2013, food researcher Dr. Ian Mosby, the University of Guelph in Ontario, exposed experiments buried in the Department of Indian Affairs files. Documents from 1948 to 1952 revealed that close to 1,000 residential school students were used as nutritional research subjects. Although they were already malnourished, the children were further deprived of food and health supplements such as vitamins. They were not given dental treatment because healthy teeth could distort the researchers' results. Are you fucking kidding me? So if their teeth fall out and they can't eat the crappy food that they're being given. Yep. It's like a form of torture and they can't even run away. No. The students attended Alberni Indian Residential School in British Columbia, Cecilia Jeffrey Indian Residential School and St. Mary's Indian Residential School in Kenora, Ontario, St. Paul's Boarding School, and Blood Indian Residential School in Cardston, Alberta, Shubenacadie in Indian Residential School in Nova Scotia. A nurse takes a blood sample at Alberni Indian Residential School in Alberni, British Columbia. In 1948, secret nutritional experiments were conducted here and at 5 other residential schools. The hidden crime. Sexual abuse is a hidden crime that took place behind closed doors. At many schools, parents were not allowed to visit their children. Away from their families, boys and girls were vulnerable to sexual abuse. If the children complained, they were viewed by the school authorities as liars and punished. The victims became the guilty ones. Not all children went home for the summer. Some stayed behind because their homes were too far away, or they were orphans, or their homes were broken up. Some were kept at school as punishment. In near-empty schools, the children were in the greatest danger from abusers. After leaving school, survivors buried their memories of abuse. Decades after the schools closed, they began to reveal their traumatic experiences. Phil Fontaine, Ojibwe, Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, was one of the first to speak publicly about sexual abuse. Phil's family was poor, but his home life before residential school was loving and supportive. At Fort Alexander Indian Residential School, a Catholic school in Manitoba, the physical and sexual abuse started early. In my grade 3 class, if there were 20 boys, every single one of them would have experienced what I experienced. They would have experienced some aspect of sexual abuse. Fontaine revealed, Phil Fontaine's admission in 1990 opened a dialogue on a difficult subject. Many former students soon spoke out. And that is Phil Fontaine was one of the first residential school survivors to speak publicly about abuse. That's a very brave man. That is a very brave man. I don't know how he did it, but he did it. It's pretty cool. A few photographs to share. St. Joseph's Mission opened the first Indian school in Williams Lake, British Columbia in 1886, run by Oblate Brothers and the Catholic Church. In 1890, it became an official residential school. In 1950, according to the chronicler, Wanda Story, the federal government finally saw fit to provide a budget for the mission school. At the time, about 300 students were enrolled. 180 of these were below grade 5. In 1957, the school burned down. The land and buildings were donated to the Department of Indian Affairs. The name was changed to Williams Lake Indian Residential School. Few survivors of the era have school photographs to share. People like my sister threw them on the fire when they burned the school down, reveals survivor Gabrielle Leroux. By 1967, students from outlying areas attended public schools but still slept in the dormitory. In 1989, the Caribou Tribe Council began to investigate the sexual abuse that took place at the Williams Lake School. The perpetrators were convicted and spent time in prison. A survivor speaks. I started out at North Kamloops Elementary School, finishing up grade 6 or grade 7. Next would have been junior high school, but I was charged for a misdemeanor. As punishment, the judge transferred me to Williams Lake Indian Residential School. I had never had visitors as it was too far from home. When I got there, the school said I didn't know my religion, so they shipped me back into grade 4. After 6 months, I went home for Christmas. I didn't want to go back, but I had to finish my school year. That's when the sexual abuse started, the touching and like that. After that, I went to junior school in Kamloops, but didn't know anything except how to pray. Years later, I went back to Williams Lake. It gave me an eerie feeling to see the place. I felt cold shivers to remember what happened there. Gabrielle Leroux Shuswap attended Williams Lake Indian Residential School in British Columbia 1958 to 1960. He works in health and security for the gathering place of City of Vancouver of Community Health. Remember the children. A cemetery was included in the plans of most residential schools. Remember the children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Let me try that again. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, part of the 2006 Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, formed the Missing Children Project to investigate student deaths at residential schools. The project recorded more than 4,100 deaths, including more than 5,000 unidentified children. In some residential schools, 20 to 75% of the students died. Pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, appendicitis, measles, physical injury, beatings, injuries from being thrown, accidents, fire, drowning, infection, freezing deaths, a fall downstairs, lack of professional medical treatment, and poor overall health were among the many ways that students died. Too young to know why they were taken from their homes, children were isolated and fearful. Dozens showed their resistance by trying to run away. Few succeeded, but their plight and sometimes their death eventually helped to bring about change. In 1937, the Canadian Press, Canada's national news agency, wrote about 4 students attending the Catholic-run Le Jacques Indian Residential School near Fort Fraser in British Columbia. On New Year's Eve, the homesick carrier boys, aged 7 to 10, ran away, hoping to reach their homes in Naudalé Indian Reserve, approximately 10 kilometers away. A 10-year-old boy returned to the school, but the others continued on in the frigid weather. By midnight, they had frozen to death on Fraser Lake. 16 hours passed before a search party was sent out. Suicide was also a tragic reality. In the summer of 1920, for example, 9 boys formed a suicide pact at Williams Lake Indian Residential School in British Columbia. They ate poisonous water hemlock together. 8 survived. Augustine Allen Shuswap of Cannon Lake, British Columbia, did not make it. The survivor speaks. The priest caught a runaway and shaved his head. At supper time, a young boy was teasing the runaway, and a fight started because of that. The next thing I saw was the priest and the runaway fighting under the table. It scared me because I was just a little guy. Kids today need to know where they are coming from. Gordon Shawanda, Anishinaabe Ojibwe, attended the St. Charles Garnier College in Spanish, Ontario from 1952 to 1958. He is an Ojibwe language teacher and affordable housing advocate. A boy gave me a note for another girl. The nun saw it and read it aloud to all the kids. The note said, "I love you and I dream of you every night." All kinds of love talk, and everybody laughed. For taking that note, the nun made me stand in the corner for a week at lunchtime with only bread and water to eat. The girls used to make me a meat sandwich and sneak it to me. One donated a slice of bread, another gave me a slice of meat. Violet Rossetti Okima, Carrier.